we'll do that right now. Okay, we are on. Um, Today, we're going to look at a very interesting chapter of history. I didn't talk to Steve again about that song. That would have fit in today. The blood is still there, but I think he told you who the composer is. Yeah, we might do that because we're going to do the end of the plagues, and we're moving on, crossing the Red Sea today, and doing that. If you find it, do it at any point in the process. So before the break today, we'll be looking at chapters 13 of Exodus through 15, and then after the break, the last part of chapter 15 and on through 18. Let me see. Yeah, if you could do the honors, that would be good. So if you have your Bibles and want to open up to Exodus. Actually, I'll give you the first question. It's in the last part of chapter 12, verses 48 and 49 of chapter 12 of Exodus. Will give you a correct answer on the first one on your quiz. And that is it true or false? You had to be a Jew or a convert to Judaism in order to eat the Passover meal. And you'll find that answer in verses... chapter 12, verses 48 and 9. In fact, really, as you do this quiz, maybe the most valuable part, if you ever keep any of these things for later reference or study, would be if you write in the scripture reference where the question and its answer came from. So in that case, it's 12, verses 48 and 9. I'm trying as we go along to tell you that this is not all just my opinion. Although 3 of the 4 answers every time are answers that I think would be cute and sometimes correct, but one of them is pretty solid scripture, at least every time. So, that's the fun of multiple choice. You can throw some outrageous things in there and get away with it because it doesn't matter, the correct one's there. I've referred before to a couple of things today I want you to be praying for. Probably a lot of you folks will not know the folks down in Clifton Forge, Virginia, but I have a very good friend in ministry, Jim Lee, who's married to a gal from Clifton Forge. Jim's from Pittsfield, Mass, originally, about my age, a couple of years older, and his wife's brother passed away. Sid Nicely. He was really high up in the Geico insurance business. He's one of the top guys for Geico for several years. Had his leg amputated when he was just a young kid and has always walked with a prosthesis. He's quite a guy. He's an inspirational guy. But anyway, he passed away a few days ago, and we thought we were going to have Gene Peters here this week to visit one day, but he's down there at the funeral today, 11 o'clock this morning, right about the time we take our break in another hour. They'll be having that memorial service, and I texted Jim and say, you and Nancy are much in our prayers today. We'll be thinking of you, even as we do the Bible study. But we don't sorrow as those who have no hope. Isn't that a great thing? As sad as it is when we say our goodbyes, not only is this not the end, but it's not even the end necessarily of ministry. As you've seen this week with Wes's ministry, he's been gone now for maybe 3 years this fall, and yet he still ministers. I've referred several times to Hebrews chapter 11 because I was preaching from that 2 weeks ago up in BB Quebec camp meeting, and preaching on some of those characters because I love that chapter. But the very first person of faith that they cite in that chapter is Abel. You can't go much farther back in Genesis than Abel. And he was commended by God because of his sacrifice. He gave the right kind of a sacrifice, and his brother didn't. His brother got jealous and mad at him because God had approved his, and said his brother killed him. God had warned his brother, you better not have that attitude, because he said sin is crouching at the door. But anyway, he was cited as someone who was commended as righteous because he did the right thing, and that's a great passage to talk to about tithing. What does tithing mean? And it says about, you go back to Genesis, and it says about Abel that his sacrifice was of the first of his flock, and the fat portions, or the best portion, he gave to God first and best. And his brother gave to God some of. And I think a lot of times we're guilty of giving some of rather than first and best. But at any rate, so it says about Abel that God commended him as righteous and spoke well of his offerings. And then I love this final statement. There's only one verse devoted to most of these guys. But in verse 4 of Hebrews 11, it says, and by faith Abel still speaks to us even though he's dead. There's a lot of people that we have known who still have a powerful testimony, and they're still speaking to us today, even though they've been gone a long time. So at any rate, and tonight, I think it'll probably be shared tonight. Well, we're going to try to make sure that Wes's ministry continues on for anybody who would like for it to, through this CD. And so the CD we've been using in the evening, Brent's been preaching from. We'll announce about that tonight, how we can maybe get some of those distributed if you folks are interested in that. But in the meantime, want to give it a shot, Steve? Okay. At the break would be a good time to do that. Meantime, we're going to be turning to Exodus chapter 13. And some of you who've looked at verses 48 and 9, in chapter 12, what's the answer? Is it true or false that you had to be a Jew to eat the Passover? Okay. That's what it says. A foreigner who resides among you, who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover, must have all the males in his household circumcised, and then he can take part like one who is born in that land. And no uncircumcised male can eat of it. But the same law applies both to the native born and to the foreigner who resides among you. So it's kind of interesting. From the very first Passover, God made provision for foreigners to be included. God is very inclusive. He's strict to his word. There's a lot of people think our faith is something that's unfair because Jesus said, I'm the only way. No one's going to come except through me. But it's amazing when you read through Scripture to see how God goes out of his way to include those who will come. And in this case, even the very first Passover that was established, they made ways for foreigners. Why do you think that people would want to identify with the Jewish people who at this point in their history were slaves in bondage and pretty much down on their luck, you would say? Who would want to be part of them? Why do you think it was God made provision for people who were not Jewish to celebrate this great thing with them, which was being celebrated in faith because the Passover hadn't happened yet? Okay. He knew he was going to be opening the gospel to the Gentiles. And everything in this, I said on the very first day, one of the reasons why I love the Mosaic covenant is because all of it speaks to our salvation. It's highly symbolic. It's real. It really happened. It's highly symbolic, but it points to our salvation. And, the Abrahamic covenant was a great promise about his people and his family and how God would use him and all the earth would be blessed through him. Even the covenant he made with Adam, really, and then made a covenant with David about the Messiah coming through him. There's some great covenants that God promises that God made, covenants in the Old Testament. But the Mosaic covenant is one that, it directly affects us because it's really about his redemption, deliverance, salvation. And so all of these attributes, I guess you'd say, of the Mosaic covenant are represented in Christ. And so it's kind of fascinating stuff. It's educational stuff. And it's inspiring stuff because all of these principles apply in our lives today. And that's mostly what I'm trying to do with you this week is point out there's so many great just verses and references about Moses that you say, well, that's still true. That's true today. That's the way God works today. And that's who he is. So at any rate, down in verses 4 and 5 of chapter 13, you will find the correct answer to number 2. This was probably trivia because who really knows the months in the Hebrew calendar? But at any rate, the Hebrews' deliverance from Egypt was celebrated in the month of Aviv. Okay, Hebrews 13, 4 and 5 says, today, in the month of Aviv, you are leaving. And when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, and Jebusites, the land that he swore to your ancestors to give to you, a land that flows with milk and honey, you're to observe this ceremony in this month. So the month of Aviv. In the 13th verse of this chapter, you'll find question 3 answered. After arriving in Canaan, the Israelites were to redeem every firstborn donkey with a lamb, or else they were to pray for forgiveness, sacrifice a dove, trim the hooves of the donkey, or break its neck. That seems like the strangest of all the answers, doesn't it? So somebody read what 13:13 says. Read it out loud for us. Break its neck. Why do you think that? It's hard to think in Old Testament economy today, but why break its neck? At the very least, we know it had to be sacrificed, right? There had to be death. And a broken neck pretty well assured that. I was telling my brothers last night, I had a good friend in my church in North Carolina, in part because he was a Red Sox fan, and they're hard to come by in North Carolina. He was from New Hampshire, born in Keene, New Hampshire, married a girl from Brattleboro, Vermont. So he married a Vermonter like I did, and so he was he was a good friend, and came into the church after we'd been there a few years, and it was just nice hearing him talk. He never lost his accent. He never had anything close to a Southern accent. I used to tease him all the time because he sounded like he left New Hampshire yesterday. But anyway, he was a big Red Sox fan. But and every time I'm in New England, I would buy the Boston newspapers, as he loved all the Boston sports teams. And then I'd take them back to him. And my first Sunday back home and I'm in New England a lot, at least 4 times a year actually, because 2 big sport meetings, and then we go to Vermont. Shirley's family is all pretty much, her generation of the family is pretty much in the same hometown. 2 of her sisters and her brothers still live in Morrisville. So we're back there again and again and again. Christmas week and 1 week in July. And I always buy Boston papers, take them back to Joe, and he reads them all, every word. Well, the sports page, he reads them all. Bruins, Patriots, Celtics, Red Sox, and it doesn't matter. He's just starved for the inside information on them. But anyway, Joe last July was getting out of bed in the night and caught his feet in the bed sheets. They had a hardwood floor in their bedroom, and fell and broke his neck, and he died within the week. because a broken neck is, especially for an old codger, I guess you'd say, he was in his early 80s. But it's a serious injury. And so, at any rate, I still miss Joe. And this last couple of weeks, as I've been buying Boston papers, which is like you almost have to get a second mortgage on your house to buy a newspaper anymore. It's the Sunday edition of the Globe is $6. And I really only want the sports section. But anyway, yeah, you can get to it online, but that's another story with our computer mess we're in right now. So at any rate, these papers, I gave them to my brother-in-law when I was in Vermont because he's a Red Sox fan. But it's kind of sad not taking all my Boston papers home to give to Joe. No more Joe to enjoy them. But anyway, when we get to the kingdom, we'll spend some time talking about the glory years of 2004 and 2007 with Joe, among all the other things going on. But they break the neck of this donkey. Interesting. And there again, that's probably trivia. You may not need to know that. But it does speak of the death of the sacrifice. The bones of which patriarch traveled with, you may know this right off the cuff. This is one you're likely to know. Which patriarch's bones traveled with the Hebrews when they left Egypt? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, or Joseph? Okay. I thought you might have that one from the story because it's right there at the end of Genesis, the story. And, well, just before that, they made the journey with Jacob and his remains when he died. And Joseph, they had a whole entourage, including many of the Egyptian officers, and went up there to Hebron, where we wish we could go today, and the big strips. Has any, in recent years, probably none of the big strips have been able to get there, but every year we're hopeful. 2018 was the last one. Yeah. Where the patriarchs are buried in Hebron, there's a mosque that's built over the top of it, and it's certainly in territory that is Islamic control. And so it's touch and go. Every once in a great while, if you're on a pilgrimage, you'll get to visit. And it's worth the visit. One time in my life, I did get to go and underneath that mosque and look at, and they have the sepulchres, the big rock form that they say, tradition says, we're talking thousands of years ago, but that's where Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and their wives, and in the case of Jacob, it's not Rachel, because we know she was giving birth to Benjamin on the way to Bethlehem when she died, and so she's buried somewhere along the road to Bethlehem. But it was Leah, the wife that he didn't bargain for, but Laban, his father-in-law, tricked him into marrying. A lot of great stories in the Old Testament. But anyway, so Jacob and Leah, and Isaac and Rebekah, Abraham and Sarah are buried all in the same vault in the same room in Hebron. And so we read all about that at the end of Genesis. And then Joseph said, look, he said, there's been a promise from God. I know you're going to go back to your homeland one of these days. And when you do, have them take my bones, and you can bury me up there in my homeland too. It took 4 centuries for that to happen because they were 400 years in Egypt, the Israelites. Think about that. So this story we're talking about today was a long time developing. It was started, they got to Egypt because of the famine way back in Joseph's day, and you can read about that chapters 36 through 50 of Genesis, except for the one chapter there that's about the indiscretions of his brother Judah. But there's most of the last 15 chapters of Genesis tell that Joseph story. It's great, great stuff. So that's how they got there. It doesn't tell that much about how they fell into disfavor, but there's some stuff in Exodus chapter 1 about that. But they were in serious bondage and trouble, and they were a threat, I guess. The Egyptian royalty felt that they were a threat because there's so many of them. They'd multiplied. And they'd grown from 70 some that when they went down to in the millions. When we talk about the Red Sea crossing, we'll do a little bit of speculation on that, but it's probably in the millions, at least a couple of million, because what we know is the number of men, and you add to that the number of women and speculate the number of children, and it's got to be at least over 2 million people who crossed the Red Sea that night when they were going out of Egypt. So anyway, it's Joseph is the one whose bones they were carrying, and I don't know what was left of the composition of his bones after 400 years, but one thing to be said for that part of the country, it's pretty dry climate. So who knows, he might have, they hadn't rotted. His bones might have been preserved better than we would think. God didn't lead the Hebrews directly, however, from Egypt to Canaan, which would have taken them through the Philistine territory, because that road had not yet been completed. It was a toll road. I'll tell you right now, when I travel around the Northeast, my trips are affected sometimes by toll roads. I'm not going to go there. There's another way to go. Quite often, if I'm going down, for instance, as an example, don't get on the Mass Pike after going down to Worcester. Instead, I'll go down to Route 20 going across to Sturbridge and hop on 84, Interstate 84, go down through Hartford, and you skip all the tolls. Well, you can't skip the ones in Maine and New Hampshire. You can. Sometimes I've jumped off at Biddeford and gone down to Haverhill, skip the New Hampshire Pike. If I got time enough to do it, and I got other things I want to accomplish with it. But anyway, I don't think they avoided it because it was a toll road, but sometimes I do. C says, he said if they face war, meaning God said, if they face war, they could change their mind and return to Egypt. Or D, Goliath was waiting for them if they went through the Philistine country. Do you think Goliath would have been there? Not hardly. That's another one of those anachronisms. It was another 400 years before Goliath was going to be a serious threat in the Philistines. But the Philistines were forced to be reckoned with a little bit later on in history. As are the folks who live in Gaza today, by the way. It's amazing how history repeats itself. But the biggest threat to Israel in David's day were the folks who lived down in the cities around Gaza. And guess who's the biggest threat, local threat to Israel today? Hamas down there. They don't call them Philistines anymore. So which is the right answer? Read verses 17 and 18. Somebody have your Bible open to Exodus 13. 17 and 18. Has God ever had to detour your travels? Because he couldn't trust you if he went the direct route. I'll have to confess, I know that's true in my life. Jonah, when God gave him directions, went the opposite direction. I haven't always gone the opposite direction, but a lot of times I've said, well, maybe not. I got to think about this. I did not want to be a pastor when I was a kid, certainly, because my dad, ministry took a toll on my dad physically. He paid severely for it, and you pay attention when it's your family. And in those days, they referred to it as nervous breakdowns. They would probably refer to it as some kind of clinical depression now, but it laid waste to him for months and months and months at a time, a couple of times in his ministry. And I didn't aspire to that kind of a job. And so I had no intention. I knew I wanted to serve God somehow, but I also knew it wasn't going to be in that kind of ministry. And so God had to lead me in small steps. If he'd laid out the picture very far down the road, like I've worked in camp with some kids, youth camp, that they knew when they were in high school what they were going to do with their life. Alan Chamberlain down in Friendship, I had him as a camper when he was 16 years old, freshman going into sophomore year of high school. I remember one year he came into the director's cabin at Camp Amaca, and the sole had come right off his sneaker, and I said, "Alan, you've lost your sole." And he said, "I had a blowout." He called home and says, "Mom, I need another pair of sneakers if we had a blowout over here." But anyway, he knew at camp that year, he was a freshman in high school, he was going to be a minister. And I admired that, and doggone it wasn't true. You know, his whole life, God could trust him with that information. He couldn't trust me with that information. So I never knew I was going to be a pastor till I was a pastor. It's a long story you don't need to hear all of, but it was within a couple of months of my first pastorate when I knew, oh yeah, you're going to be a pastor. So anyway, that's the way it is. I thought I was heading in a direction that sounded good to me. God just said, well, it may be a surprise to you where you end up a few months from now. And it was. But anyway, I think that human nature is such that with some of us, God can't give us too much information. He just has to say, just trust me, day at a time. And that was the case with Israel. He said, now, if I send them the most direct route, they'll have a nice, pleasant, short trip, but they'll run into the kind of resistance they can't handle. And worst case scenario, they'll probably just turn around and go back into slavery. Said, we don't want to have to fight. And so I'll take them a more circuitous route. He certainly did. And not his decision, but theirs ended up costing him 40 years in the wilderness. We'll get to that over in Numbers chapter 13. You know, when the spies go out into the land and they say, we're going to have to fight and we'll probably lose. And they turn from God. And so that cost them a lot. So God knew these people pretty well. He says, when they run into serious resistance, they're going to want to turn tail and run. And they did. So at any rate, there's always a reason. Every one of these statements that God makes about them, there's always a reason. God understands. Number 6 says, Pharaoh changed his mind after letting them go, and he pursued the Israelites because God had hardened Pharaoh's heart, or Pharaoh thought that they were wandering and had become confused, or he expected that the desert had hemmed them in against the sea, or all of the above. Let's go over to the 14th chapter, and I'll read for you verses 3 and 4. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around in the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So, and then also in verse 8, that's when it actually happened. So the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. Isn't it interesting? Pharaoh, who thought he was in charge, large and in charge. You know, nobody, humanly speaking, is more powerful than Pharaoh. God is manipulating Pharaoh. He says, now I need him to really be more stubborn than he thinks he can be, and also more stupid. And so I'm going to harden his heart, and it's going to work to the advantage of my people. But because of the hardness of his heart, what happened to Pharaoh's armies? The Red Sea crossing. You know that story well. Okay, because Pharaoh was so hard-headed and hard-hearted, he lost his army because they followed into the Red Sea and they were destroyed in the Red Sea. So it's amazing how God's at work. God, he chose a stubborn guy to work with. The 10 plagues certainly proved that. After 7 of them, we saw yesterday, Pharaoh waved the white flag and said, "I've had enough. I surrender." And yet he kept hardening his heart. By the next day, he changed his mind again and said, "No, I guess we're not going to let all of our workforce go. We're gonna keep you. Change my mind. We're not going to let you go after all." He'd already said, "I have sinned." That's a pretty sturdy confession right there. I've sinned. But he changed his mind within a day. This is the train actually that's going by. It doesn't sound like the train. But if you'll notice the black trash can on the hood of the tractor, that's the steam pipe. It's bellowing out smoke for the steam engine. And the kids, they're divided into 3 groups and they have 3 major sessions. So they're on their way to game time. Train ride goes to game time for the kids. If you were only in VBS, you too could be on the float. And so we'll see that go by 3 times today. Never be distracted just because I always am. Man, it would be fun to be in VBS. Anyway, that's their train ride. And the kids love it. And they're having a great VBS this week, over 20 kids. And as I mentioned, so we're going to cut out a little bit early on Friday. They're not having a formal closing program, but they are doing some things at the end, like reciting all their memory verses and that stuff. So at the break Friday, we'll call it quits so that we can peek in at the close of the VBS stuff. Okay, so we were saying all of the above are true. The Lord hardened his heart. He thought they were wandering and become confused. They were. He expected that the desert had hemmed them in against the sea. It had. It's hard to imagine how terrifying that scene was on the banks of the Red Sea that night when they look up and they see Pharaoh's changed his mind and the armies are coming after us. What are they going to do to us now? And we've got no place we can go because they're behind us and this sea is in front of us. We're trapped. We're hemmed in, as it says here. And God had everybody just where he wanted them at that point. The stage was set for the most spectacular technological miracle, I guess you'd say, and that's recorded in the whole Old Testament. I cannot wait to get to the kingdom, to the video room, and punch up some of these scenes and see exactly what really happened. See, they're singing on the train. Happy kids. Happy kids are good. Number 7, in verses 14 and 15, at the Red Sea crossing, Moses showed great faith and never questioned the Lord. Do you think that's true or false? What does it say here in 14 and 15 of chapter 14? Moses said, "Stand firm, don't be afraid. You will see the deliverance of the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you're never going to see again." This is when they're terrified because the army is behind them. The sea's in front of them. "The Lord will fight for you. You only need to be still." Just calm down. That's a great pep talk for a leader to give. But when the Lord speaks to Moses in the next verse, it sounds like he's saying, "Why do you cry out to me?" It sounds like Moses is in a bit of a panic personally, but he's talking the good talk to the troops. The Lord said, "Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to keep moving on. Raise your staff." Remember what he had in his hand at the burning bush. "And stretch your hand out over the sea to divide the water, and the Israelites will go through." The way that he addresses Moses, "Why are you crying? Why are you whimpering?" makes it sound like God knows that Moses is not at full peace about this. He is a desperate man. And if God doesn't come through, he knows they're a mess. There's no hope for them. So the Lord said to Moses, instead of saying, great job, now do just what you just said and put your total trust in me, he says, why are you crying out? That's an interesting question. What do you think that question means in your mind? I don't know. I'm just speculating a bit here because you could probably get credit for either true or false, that he had total faith. But the way God starts addressing him after his full of faith pep talk suggests to me that he was saying, I don't know, this better work or we're toast. What do you think? Yes. Yeah. What leader wouldn't be a little bit intimidated by that, being in a situation like that? Even if you got God on your side, his pep talk was perfect. It's what everybody needed to hear, including him. He said, just be still. God's going to take care of this whole mess. And then God tells Moses, well, why are you crying out then? Just do it. I don't know. What do you think? Opinions. Who thinks that Moses' faith was never shaken by this experience and he just sailed through it? It could be true. That's a viable option. But it's a curious way that God addresses him, and this is what's recorded in Scripture. You know, what are you fussing about, Mo? Just go. And he did. I don't know. I would like to think that I would be full of faith and not a doubt in my mind at that moment if I were in leadership, but probably not. And so I'm inclined to think that Moses put up a pretty brave front, but inside his metabolism was moving very, very fast. And he said, boy, this had better work. At any rate, so if you're giving yourself credit, you can say that's either true or false. That he never questioned the Lord. Well, he cried out to the Lord and said, okay, it's time. We need you right now. Question 8 says, at the Red Sea crossing, the pillar of cloud started pouring down rain, or it lifted or it moved behind the Israelites to protect them, or it evaporated. Which is correct there? Okay, verse 19 and 20 says, the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. So throughout the night, this cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side. So neither went near the other all night long. What a fantastic idea. This is one of the reasons I think, the pyrotechnics, whatever you want to call it, of this miracle are sensational. You couldn't capture them probably on the big screen as real as they were to these people. This cloud, he was leading the people through this cloud, pillar of fire by day, and a cloud by day rather, pillar of fire by night. But God repositioned the cloud that night to give over 2 million people time to cross however wide a band of the Red Sea that he opened up. I've seen it speculated that it would need to be, to get that many people across in an 8-hour span, say, of the darkness, it would probably require at least a 2-mile wide stretch of dry ground. So it's a big swath through the sea. And again, it's because of the numbering of the men that we know there were 600,000 men, adult men, and so you add 600,000 at least women, you're up to 1.2 million, and you haven't started counting the kids yet. So you don't have to have very big families to presume we're over 2 million people that night that are crossing through. And those who have done the math say, even at a brisk march, everything keeps moving. To do it in 8 or 9 hours, you'd need at least 2 miles wide if they're shoulder to shoulder and crossing. This is no small event. And The reason the armies of Pharaoh weren't hot on their tails going through is they didn't know what was happening, because God positioned that cloud that night, and the angel of God who was in charge of that cloud moved it behind Israel. So the miracle is not just the waters parting. That's big. But the miracle really involves what God did to protect them during the crossing from the army seeing what was going on. And he never lifted the cloud till the trap was set for the armies. So it's quite an amazing story, isn't it? This is who God is. He can deliver and creative. But anyway, that's one of the reasons why I really want to see this happen, because the cloud was their protection that night, because God said, we're going to set this up so the whole evacuation is going to happen under cover of darkness, and the armies who have been watching closely, all of a sudden, they can't see. A dense fog set in. Have you read about during the Revolution when Washington's armies had to evacuate to Manhattan from the island, and the fog set in? They had to cross the bay there in lower Manhattan at night. It's a great story, one of the great miracle stories. There's a lot under George Washington, how he ever lived. He had 2 or 3 horses shot out from under him and bullets through his hat and all this stuff. And he was invincible because God had his hand on the man. So anyway, that dense fog, how the entire Revolutionary Army of America, such as it was, but many, many small boats spent the whole night crossing the channel, and a dense fog set in, and the British had ships right there in the harbor, but they couldn't see what was right in front of them because of the fog. The fog never lifted till the next day after Washington, who was in the last boat, crossed. It's a great story. You can look it up. It's for real. But this is what happened. God protected them, and so the armies are watching them, and all of a sudden, man, it's darker than usual tonight. There's a big curtain of cloud so that the whole evacuation is covered, and the enemy can't see it until the trap is set for them. Any thoughts on that? Does that bring anything to mind for you? Have you ever had any escapes that God covered until you got out of there? You don't believe in rabbit trails like I do you? You want to tell those stories. To me, it's exciting when God does this kind of stuff and reminds us of who he is. And this is no big deal for God to orchestrate the whole thing. But anyway, next time you talk about the Red Sea crossing, I've heard it said, people will say, the Bible, well, it's not really for real. And it wasn't the Red Sea, because geographically it more likely was the Reed Sea, what they call the Reed Sea, which was even dry certain seasons of the year. It might have dried up depending on what time of year it was. Well, we know what time of year it was because the month of Aviv was pretty close to our month of March. So the Passover, is about the time of the spring equinox. Easter, Christians celebrate Easter on the first Sunday of the first full moon after the spring equinox, right? Is that how it's set? So there's got to be a full moon after the equinox, and then the next Sunday is Easter. Well, that's because the Hebrew calendar, it's that time of year. It's about the time Bix goes to Israel every year. And right after Bix comes home, there's usually a lot of tourists that set in over there. But at any rate, we know what time of year it was. It wasn't dried up. Some cynical professor who said, they had a couple million people to go through, but they were walking through. If anything, their ankles would have got wet because there's probably only 2 or 3 inches of water. The response from the believer was, that's the greatest miracle in the Bible if the whole Egyptian army drowned in 2 inches of water. That's incredible. What a miracle. Yeah, it was in 2 inches of water. Yeah. Even that's a miracle, really. Yeah, it was dry. That's a good point. If the waters had just gotten rolled back, you'd expect it to be at least somewhat muddy, right? But they didn't get bogged down. but it was muddy when the Egyptians tried to go through. They got trapped. The sight and sound? When they did Moses at Sight and Sound? Yeah. Yeah. I haven't seen Moses there. I saw Daniel there last year. Yeah. It's pretty cool. Yeah. A path. Yeah, you try funneling 2 million people through a path. It's going to take a while. Yeah, that's true. I mean, everything, they were on the move. So anyway, at least your imaginations have been stirred a little bit. And that's another reason something like the Ark encounter is terrific, because all of a sudden what you've read about in the Bible, in cubits, what does that mean to us? How can I think in terms of cubits? Yeah, just go there. Yeah, I can think 18 inches, roughly, from elbow to fingertip. But then you go see, here's what it looks like, the directions that were given in Genesis 6. This is the size of it. And you say, whoa. And all the pictures you've seen on the children's books with the giraffes being too big so their neck had to stick out the window and all that kind of stuff. It's ridiculous. I mean, this boat is huge. And then they show you the size of the various animals. And yeah, if you bring junior dinosaurs, yearling dinosaurs, you could fit them all in there, no problem really. They even show you how they do it. But to me, it does a great service to people who believe the Bible to say, okay, we're going to reconstruct this, and we'll show you how it could work. And so it's a great thing. But the Creation Museum, I think, it is an experience. They call it the Ark Encounter. That's an experience, and it's very educational. But the Creation Museum, I think, is even more awesome. That was there a few years before. Same people, Answers in Genesis. And it's 40 miles removed. But you don't want to do one without the other. You got to see them both, because it's just amazing what modern technology can do to recreate some of the things we've read about for years. But it helps your imagination. It stimulates your mind. So some of you will be joining me when we get to the kingdom and say, okay, where's the archives? I want the video room. We got to see this. I've been dreaming about it, thinking about it all my life. So fantastic scene, this Red Sea crossing. We're up to 11:15 already. So the cloud was behind them to protect them. It covered the whole entire evacuation. And then, as number 9 says, and this kind of starts at the beginning of chapter 15, when Moses led the Israelites in a song of celebration, his sister Miriam echoed a brief refrain, harmonized with him. That's interesting to think about. The family singers, like the Von Trapps and The Sound of Music, maybe. My wife is from Stowe, Vermont, and that's Maria Von Trapp country up there. The Trapp family lodge in Stowe. We were just up there last week. And they're all buried out there in the side. And Shirley loves The Sound of Music. That's her favorite. And her dad did at least 2 or 3 special Finnish carpentry projects for Maria at the lodge, because he was a Finnish carpenter. So he knew Maria Von Trapp personally. And anyway, all that stuff. So the family singers. So maybe Miriam was good at harmonizing, took on a part, accompanied him on the zither. I've always wanted to hear someone play the zither, because it's a biblical instrument, where she criticized his pitch. That happens with sisters sometimes. Which of these do you think is the most accurate? Could have been 2. Yeah, I made a big deal about B, but it's actually A. If you look at, I don't know which version of the Bible you're looking at, but if you look at the 15th chapter, most of it is the song that Moses is singing. It's kind of indented or maybe in quotes through verse 18 of the song. He says, I will sing to the Lord, verse 1, for he is highly exalted, the horse and the driver he is hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He's become my salvation. And all the way down through verse 18. And then verse 19 says, and when Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen all went into the sea, the Lord brought the waters of the sea back over them, but the Israelites walked through the sea, as has just been mentioned, on dry ground. Then Miriam, the prophet, Aaron's sister, and also Moses' sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and with dancing. So we could have also said there, she did some dancing after Moses did his singing, or when Moses. And then Miriam sang to them. It's actually the first, from the first verse of what Moses sang. So she's repeating, sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted, both the horse and the driver is hurled in the sea. And that's all we get of Miriam's song. So that's why I refer to it here as a brief refrain. Now, she might have done a whole song, but according to Scripture, all we have is her grabbing an instrument to play, a timbrel, probably like we would say a tambourine or something like that, and started dancing and singing that first verse as a refrain. I'd love to hear the tune, wouldn't you? That'd be fun to sing in worship. We've got tunes that we've made up for this parts of this song, but just like when they left the upper room that night after Jesus had been praying for his disciples in John 17, and then they left the room and they were singing. We can kind of speculate from the Psalms, even probably narrow it down to what the Psalms that they usually sang at Passover. And it was probably one of those very Psalms. So we got kind of an idea of what the lyrics might have been. We can narrow it down, but we don't have any idea what the tune was. And so it'll be good to learn all that stuff. I suspect our praises in the kingdom will be very creative, but also some of them will be very historically rooted. Praises that God has been hearing for centuries and for years. So anyway, I don't know. This says a brief refrain. So what I think is the correct answer of those is maybe the least ridiculous, is she echoed a brief refrain. But she did re-sing part of the Song of Moses, Miriam did, as she celebrated. I don't know. What do you think? You think she did the whole thing? Go ahead, Tony. What's your question? It's a better one. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He was there. It doesn't say that he was drowned, but his horses and chariots and horsemen were, yeah. But yeah, Pharaoh apparently he led them out of Egypt. So he was on the hillside that night when the cloud shut him out. And so he was, as I often say about Pharaoh, he was large and in charge. He was the man. Yeah. 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 Anyway, he survived it. Back when we were in Bible college, we even had to learn which Pharaoh it was. Tutankhamun or Amenhotep III, or Eugene Merrill knew, and he made us know for the exam. But I can't say that I remember which. I got to go back to my Egyptian history. But there was a time when we thought we knew pretty well which Pharaoh it was. Any other comments on that? Okay, we're going to be right on time for our break then. I tried to do that about 10 minutes of 11. So number 10 for the Rosses. Which one, if you were on a golf course with the Rosses, who would you most likely hear say this? And I've heard it many times. It's not fair, I don't care, it's not fair. Usually, after you hit your best shot and you still couldn't clear the water, or something like that. And, okay, I'm trying, but this just isn't working. Who do you think that might be? I think I've got a golf quote from Wes later on in the week, but this would have been my dad. My dad, in fact, one time my dad played with my nephew from Shirley's side of the family, visited us in Charlotte for a while. And Dad came through and we played golf. And one of those deals, he tried to hit it over the pond, and in those days he wasn't hitting them that far. Gave it his best shot, and just barely hit the far bank and trickled back into the pond. And there it was. It's not fair. I don't care. It's not fair. And so my nephew Mike, that happened probably 30 years ago. Every time I golf with him, at least sometime during it, Mike says, "It's not fair. I don't care. It's not fair." You learn from these things. I'll just end the break with this anecdote. I was going to Barberville, Kentucky one time for meetings, and the pastor there, Leonard Lesser, doesn't play golf. And I said, but I passed this place coming in here, came through Cumberland Gap and set up the interstate. And it was called the oldest continuously played golf course in America. And it dated back to Revolutionary days. And they even played it right through the Civil War. They never closed the golf course. So it was a 9-hole course. The oldest continuously played golf course in America. And I said, wow, that would be fun to play. Couldn't find anybody in his church who played golf. I said, Leonard, if you don't mind, one afternoon this week, I'm going to just run down there. It's only about 25 miles down the road, and check out that golf course. So I did, and I was walking around, and I got to one hole where it was a dog leg, and to clear the creek, you had to hit it probably 200 yards. It would have been my best shot to ever even clear the creek. And then beyond the creek, it turned left, and there was a giant oak tree about 40 yards in front of you in the fairway before you got to the green. So you had to figure out how to get around that tree. So anyway, I laid up, as they say in golf. I wasn't going to put the ball in the creek. And so the second shot, I got up there next to the tree. It took me 3 to get to the green, and it was probably a par 4. So anyway, the next time I was playing, I'm all alone, got nothing to lose. So the next time I got to that tee for the back 9, I said, I'm going to go for it. This time I'm really going to go for it. See if I can clear that creek. And got lucky and cleared the creek. So I'm laying on the far side of the creek looking at the green and said, I could get on this thing in regulation. I could get on it too, because I went for it and cleared the creek. So I was pretty doggone proud of myself until I hit my next shot. Hit dead center of that tree, went whizzing by my right ear, back into the creek. And I said, as my dad had taught me, it's not fair. I don't care. There's nothing that's fair about this game. Anyway, that is a true story, but there's no one to vouch for it because it was just me and God that day. Anyway, let's take about 10 or 12 minutes and get a break, and then we are going to go into, we're going to cover chapters 15 through 18, the rest of 15 through 18, and let you go. There's a song about the 10th plague that is a gospel song that I have a pastor friend who's right now in the hospital recovering from a heart attack. But he's a singer, and he sung this song, and I love the message of it because it relates to the cross. It's called "The Blood Was Still There," and so you know the story. They had to put the blood on the doorposts that night, and this song speculates about a Hebrew boy who couldn't sleep because he wanted to be sure that the blood was on the door. It wasn't Santa Claus coming; it was the angel of death that was coming through that night. So Steve found it, and we're going to give it a shot right here.
One dark night in Egypt, a fearful time had come for one little Hebrew boy who was his father's firstborn son. Now with the angel of death passing low, it was hard to fall asleep. But one little lamb stood in his mind as he lay there counting sheep. He wondered why the young lamb had to die, why his blood was on the door. Through the wind and rain it still remained, but he wanted to be sure. So he called out to his earthly father with a trembling voice so scared, crying, "Father, will you please look and see if the blood is still there?" He said, "Son, now don't you worry, for the blood is there to stay. The wind may blow and the rain may fall, but it won't just wash away. The blood will stand the raging storm. It's been applied with loving care. Safe, secured, you can rest assured that the blood is still there." Looking over the damage Satan's storm had left behind, the flood of endless questions, doubt had filled my mind. The fear that gripped my troubled soul brought me back to my knees in prayer, crying, "Father, will you please look and see if the blood is still there?" He said, "Son, now don't you worry, for the blood is there to stay. The wind may blow and the rain may fall, but it won't just wash away. Storm, it's been applied with loving care. Safe, secured, you can rest assured that the blood is still there. Safe, secured, you can rest assured that the blood
Gary Duty, did you say D-U-T-I? D-U-T-Y, okay. So if you ever want to find that song, "The Blood Was Still There," it's Gary Duty that is the writer of it. Now, for a real bonus question. Steve has a bloody sock as his screensaver and has for many years. So who knows why? We're talking great moments in Red Sox history. It was a red, the stirrup sock was red, you saw. So we're talking Boston Red Sox. Why would a bloody sock be on his screen for 22 years as a screensaver? Curt Schilling. And what they had to sew the sheath together, stitch it before every game that he pitched. It wasn't the World Series. It was to beat the Yankees. The amazing 4-game sweep of the Yankees after being behind by 3 games in 2004. That led to the World Series, which was almost anticlimactic. Right? The Cardinals had no chance after we'd beat the Yankees in 4 straight. Strike ALS, Lou Gehrig disease. Anyway, so there it is. I'll bet that's unique. You've probably never seen that as a screensaver before. I have, only because I've seen Steve's computers quite a bit. So at any rate, so another great moment in history you learned about. This happens to be Red Sox history. But come on, we hadn't won a World Series at that point in 86 years. And so it was a big deal to those of us Red Sox fans. Okay, we'll hand out the quiz that has the real questions and get into this. If you guys can help us. See if we can at least introduce you to this section. We're kind of flying through this stuff. There's 5 books of Moses, and his life is part of 4 of them. So we're going through it in a hurry. And this particular session, I'm going to pick up at verse 22 of Exodus 15 and go on through Exodus 18. So we're covering some ground. So if you have your Bible back open again, the first question will be found, correct answer will be found in verses 22 to 24 of Exodus 15. To me, this is one of the most amazing anecdotes of the entire Exodus. Because, as I've already confessed to you, in my mind, it's harder to find a bigger biblical miracle than the crossing of the Red Sea. A more majestic, dramatic, life-changing. They were dead. They were hemmed in. There's no way out of this. And we got 2 million people, women and children. There's no way to escape. And God's deliverance was so majestic in every way. Not only miraculous, but the way that he did it, the way he pulled it off. So, in light of that, if you had lived through, I don't know what the biggest miracle you've seen in your life is, but if you had lived through that miracle, how long do you think your faith would remain supercharged? You could go for a long time off of that miracle. So this first question is a pivotal one, and to me this is one of the most amazing parts of the story. How long after the ultimate liberating victory, the Red Sea crossing, was it before the people began to grumble and complain? 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days? 3 days? You have got to be kidding. You couldn't get to Wednesday night prayer meeting from the greatest Sunday in history? Or is this not us? God couldn't have done anything bigger for them. And they, in the faith of that, and the strength of that miracle, their faith never faltered for almost 3 whole days. It's incredible to me, but we need to be reminded of this. This is important stuff. So, verses 22 to 24 of chapter 15 tells us this. So Moses led Israel from the Red Sea. They went into the desert of Shur, and for 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding any water. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. And so that's why the place was called Marah. That gives you a hint into the Hebrew word, I guess. And so the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" So they're grumbling and complaining 3 days after the greatest miracle in biblical history, at least in the Old Testament. We wouldn't do that, would we? Yeah, that's right. How long is the afterglow? Yeah, when you go home from camp, I remember a camp as a kid, I'm going to be different this school year. I'm not going to be ashamed to be a Christian. I'm going to, you're supercharged. You come down off the mountain, you're supercharged and good to go. To me, this 3-day thing is incredible. Many, many times as I've read through this story, I just have to stop then and say, you got to be kidding. What is God thinking of these people? What's it going to take to stabilize their faith? No, God is going to provide. If you don't know God is not going to provide after what you saw 3 nights ago, when will you ever learn? Is it possible for you to even have anything that resembles what we would call a solid faith in God? But anyway, in case you haven't noticed it before, they traveled 3 days into the wilderness and they're complaining again. If it wasn't so much like us, I would hesitate to bring it up. But I know how I've disappointed God greatly after he's blessed me greatly. And a few days later, I find myself, how could I not be more faithful at this point in my life? Anyway, be reminded of this. Write in the reference. Read it once in a while. The 15th chapter, verses 22 to 24. 3 days. And so the bitter waters at Marah were made drinkable by a touch of Moses' rod or by boiling. We live in a place, we have a water service. It's not the city of Hickory. It's a water service that comes out of Pennsylvania, actually, and I live in North Carolina. But anyway, we'll get a notice that's saying, well, your water service, something's happened, and a break in the line, so start boiling your water. We'll tell you when it's safe when we get it back from the lab again. That happens 2 or 3 times a year to us where we live. So boil water, that's really inconvenient. I have to confess, I've brushed my teeth in contaminated water. They're probably going to fall out of my head, but boil water to brush your teeth, come on. Anyway, I'm not the germaphobe I need to be. But careful filtration, throwing in a piece of wood. So what at this point, was it the rod or was it the wood? Yeah, sometimes we forget about this. We remember the rod stuff, but verse 25 says, Moses cried out to the Lord when the people cried out to him or grumbled. And the Lord showed him a piece of wood, and he threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. And the Lord issued a ruling and an instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, if you listen carefully to the Lord your God, do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases that I have brought on the Egyptians. For I am the Lord your God who heals you. Jehovah Rapha, one of the many names for God in the Bible, but Jehovah Rapha is the one who heals us. There's a place called Rapha House in Texas, I believe it is, because I've known people who have gone there for counseling and treatment and healing to deeply bruised people, been traumatized. And It's called Rapha House for that reason. Jehovah Rapha. I'm the one who heals you. And so then they came to a place where there were 12 springs, and they were a lot happier there. So anyway, in this particular instance, piece of wood, what do you think was so special about that wood? Because God gave it to him. The healing properties may have been in the wood, but if they were, it's because God put them there, right? God, who knows why he chooses to act in the way he does. So the Lord said, okay, here's a piece of wood, just toss that in. And they needed to do some act of obedience, a simple act of obedience. God's pretty creative. I think that's, the real power is God said it, so they did it. That's where the healing came from. Moses was obedient. I don't know what good this is going to do, but, and all of a sudden, good potable drinking water. I don't think it was from Poland Springs, just down the road, but man, have they made a lot of money off of Poland Springs. It's all over the place. It's in New York City. We don't have Poland Spring down where we are, but it's all over the Northeast, bottled water. Anyway, at Marah, number 3, at Marah, God revealed himself to Israel as, we've talked about this, Rapha, the Lord who heals, the Lord who provides. Which name of God is that? Remember? You know that chorus, Jehovah Jireh, my provider. He's sufficient for me. Jehovah Jireh is the Lord who provides. And he is that too, for sure. The Lord who saves, and Yahweh. The names of God, all the names we have that we use for God have a reason, and they're all based on Bible history. But at any rate, so you learned the Rapha one is from this story. Number 4, true or false? Within 5 or 6 weeks after being delivered from slavery in Egypt, the entire nation of Israel was grumbling against Moses and Aaron, saying, if only we had died in Egypt. Wow. It's really blasphemy, isn't it? If only we had died in Egypt. It certainly is full-blown blasphemy when they send the spies out and 10 of them come back and say, no way can we take this place. And Joshua and Caleb say, but God said he's giving us this place. We don't have to really take it. He said he's giving us this place. And they said, yeah, but we can't. The people are giants. They exaggerated. They said everybody there is a giant. That wasn't true. But anyway, we'll look at that in Numbers 13 in passing tomorrow. But by the time they were done reasoning about their fear, they were blaspheming God. They were saying, what kind of a God would bring women and children out into the wilderness to have them be destroyed? What kind of a God is that anyway? Who would dare say that about their God? When you start bringing women and children into it, obviously you are defaming the character of God. You're saying God is immoral. He's willing to destroy women and children. Anyway, it's quite amazing how far they've gone. But anyway, in verse 2 and 3 of chapter 16, it says, in the desert the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all of the food that we wanted. But you've brought us out here into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. You know what selective memory is? If you don't, it's right here. They were working so hard, and then the job got harder when no straw was supplied to make the bricks. And they had no future, and they had no life. And they were saying, we'd give anything to get out of this, but there's no way out of it. There's no one who could ever lead us out of this. Pharaoh is the most powerful ruler in the world at this time. There's no way out of this dilemma we are in. And God showed them the way. And within a matter of a very few weeks, they are saying, sure wish we were, the 15th day of the second month And they went out in the first month, so the second month. So it wasn't more than 6 weeks, according to verse 1 of chapter 16. Within the first 6 weeks of their journey, they're saying, God would have been much better to us if he just let us die in Egypt, because we're going to starve to death out here. And remember the great food we got in Egypt? They talk about that again, too, in Numbers 14, after the spies come back. They talk about it. We got all the leeks and garlic, and I said, I could live a lifetime without leeks, I think. I do kind of like garlic, but I can imagine little kids going around with signs that say, leeks, reeks. We don't want our leeks. But the adults, we got all these nice flavorings. And, man, we were really eating. They said here they had pots of meat. It's like they were all wealthy. They were all living at the top of the food chain, which they were not. They were barely existing. But they could see total starvation ahead. That's all they could see. And so they were saying, too bad we didn't get to die in Egypt like the last several generations have, working their fingers to the bone and having nothing to show for it. And now God is delivering us, and we're going to starve to death out in the desert. Be better if we were back in where we were living. At least it would have been familiar. We know about that kind of grief. We never know what's going to happen from day to day out here. And the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain down bread from heaven. And this is the manna part of the story. So at any rate, people are people. So it is true, within 5 or 6 weeks, it was by the middle of the second month, after being delivered from Egypt, that they were saying, if we'd only died in Egypt, we'd been much better off. The meaning of the word manna is bread from heaven, breakfast, what is it, and enough. Which is the most logical answer, do you think? What is it? Yeah, it's actually a question. Verse 15 of chapter 16 says, and so the thin flakes, it describes it a little bit. When the dew was gone in the morning, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. And verse 15, when the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? They did not know what it was. And thus the name manna came from. Manna, when we reflect back on it and we see how it's amazing God fed them in the wilderness and gave them bread to eat every day, we think of manna in more positive terms. We would think bread from heaven, which is what it was. It was bread from heaven. Breakfast, because it happened in the morning, or enough, God will always give us. And the story of the manna says, don't collect enough for tomorrow, because it'll rot overnight if you do. You need to trust the Lord for today. Today, and tomorrow's another day. He'll provide for tomorrow. But don't try to hoard it, because then you'll lose the blessing. It'll spoil on you. So enough would have been a good name for it. Just take enough. Everybody just take enough. My esophagus doc, I call him, that I first went to with acid reflux several years ago. He's a Jewish guy. I have another Jewish doctor that always wears his yarmulke, and Stevenson doesn't always wear his yarmulke, but he's very Jewish. But anyway, he told me one time, one of his lectures, he likes to tell me how fat I am, and he's not a skinny guy himself, but I've never dared to really tell him, You looked in the mirror lately, Doc. But anyway, he told me one time, he says, Americans eat way too much. He says, and whether you're at home or in a restaurant, the first thing you need to do is push 1/3 of the food on your plate off to the side and don't eat that. 2/3 of whatever's on your plate will always be enough. For any American, whether you're at home, in a restaurant, take 1/3 and throw it away, but don't eat it. That was his advice to me. And my response to him was, do you have to do that with seconds too? It seems like a lot of food to waste. Every plateful, you throw away 1/3 of it. Does that apply to seconds? He was pretty humorless. He saw no humor in that at all. Anyway, enough. God said, don't save it up. Don't say, well, we've got to make sure we have some tomorrow. Maybe God won't come through tomorrow morning, or the weather may change or something. I don't know. So hoard it. And as soon as he told them not to, some of them did it. That's what it tells us. Some of them did it. So the next few questions talk about that a little bit. The manna, question 6. The manna spoiled when it was kept overnight, except on the Sabbath. Miracles are happening every week here. It never spoiled on the Sabbath because of one of these reasons. No refrigeration, the heat of the desert, maggot infestation, or God's plan to provide for his people daily, every day. What's the real reason that it spoiled every day but Sabbath? Because God's plan was, I'm going to provide for you day by day by day. And so, now these other climate reasons may have had something to do with it, naturally speaking, but the real reason it spoiled, and it never spoiled on the Sabbath, it was always good for 2 days because they weren't supposed to work on the Sabbath. The real reason was God says, I'm going to provide for you every day. And so you need to trust me for that day. How does that apply to our life today, by the way? You've never worried about something that was 2 or 3 days away, I hope, in your whole life. You know, maybe a week away, a month away. Yeah, it's, the principles are they're the same. There's so much in this story. And like I say, this story is the basic pattern. The new covenant is overlaid on the Mosaic covenant from the Old Testament more than any other. It's even the song we just heard about the doorpost, and then it applies directly to the cross, the blood on the cross. So God's plan was to provide daily. Number 7 says, and so the Hebrew people quarreled with Moses at Rephidim because they feared that the Lord had left them. They were hungry, they were tired, or they just liked to quarrel. Remember one of the quotes from my mom that was in the quiz yesterday? Fight, kids, fight. I hate peace. I can still hear that. Maybe they just like to quarrel, so that's why they kept giving Moses a hard time. Verse 7, chapter 17, verse 7. Somebody read that verse, please. 17:7. Can you believe these people doubted that God was with them? It seems incredible to us. How can you miss the miracle of what had happened to you since a couple of months ago when you were in slavery in Egypt and you knew there was no way your generation would ever be liberated? It can't happen. There's no physical way. I can't even imagine a way, not with Pharaoh in charge. He's not going to destroy the whole Egyptian economy to let us out of here. He's not going to have a nice, kind day. He never has a nice, kind day. It's never going to happen. And even if it were to happen, he'd change his mind. And all that was true. And so all that God has done for them, the Red Sea crossing, the miracle with the wood in the water, the miracle of the manna, all these things just keep happening. And their basic question is, you think the Lord's still with us? Yeah. You ever wonder why sometimes the Lord's patience is tried severely by the likes of us? Haven't you been paying attention? Haven't you noticed any of this, the way I've been providing for you? But they feared that the Lord had left them, it says in that 7th verse. So when Aaron and Hur helped Moses hold his staff high before the Lord, another great story in the battle with the Amalekites. Moses was just human. As long as he held that staff up, there was nothing magic in the staff, but there was something symbolic in that staff. And so he was on the mountain, and the troops down in the valley, they could look up there and see Moses, and he's got the staff to remind them God is with us. God is fighting this battle. But then, you know what? You hold your arms that way long enough, Moses just couldn't do it. And so his brother and Hur, one of the army guys, came alongside and held his arms up. And as long as it was up, they were prevailing. And they won the battle that day against the Amalekites. great story. It's this 17th chapter is all about it, starting in verse 8. A great story because it says the Hebrew warriors, when Aaron and Hur helped Moses hold his staff high, it finally began to rain. No, that wasn't it. The Hebrew warriors under Joshua prevailed against the Amalekites. Where the sun stood still, God can do that. He did that later in the Old Testament. Where the earth began to shake, he can do that too. But in this case, it was symbolic, and they drew courage from just looking at that symbol. I don't believe for a minute it was magical, but it was symbolic, and so God used that as a demonstration to them, and so the miracle happened because of that. The ninth question, interesting. Jethro was to Moses a critic, a counselor and advisor, a father-in-law, or all of the above. All of the above. The Jethro visit, here again, I think you've all read this story sometime or another, or a series of stories. His father-in-law came to visit him, and he said, this what you're doing is not good. You're going to kill yourself the way you are administering justice to these people, because you're the only court of appeal that they have. And so they come to you all day long with their little picky stuff or with their major stuff. And you have no administration that you can dole out assignments to. And so this is what you need to do. You need to select some people who can represent God on your behalf and school them the best you can. Let them know the basics of God, how God would rule on these situations, and then let them take care of it. And so the minor judges will take care of the minor stuff, and then they'll move it up, just like our judicial system, I guess. Here in the States, you can tell, so you go all the way to the Supreme Court. But you really need to get organized, Moses, or you're going to wear out before this journey is done, and you won't be able to finish your job. And so at first he was a critic. He's saying, Moses, you don't realize it, but you're burning out. He was a counselor and advisor. Why? Because he loved his family. And his son-in-law, he could see, needed some advice. He was a father-in-law, certainly. He was all of those things to him. So the detail of this chapter, unfortunately, you don't have time to go in it, but you can read it as well. It's a self-teaching chapter. And so read through this chapter and notice the details of it. But great wisdom. And God used a pagan guy who really wasn't Jewish. He wasn't part of the chosen people. But God used him in Moses' life. And Moses said, you know what? What you say is true. I need to get organized so that I don't think I'm the repository of all wisdom. God is the repository of all wisdom. And I just happen to be the one that God is working through and represents him to these people. So at any rate, great story. We'll let you do that as a self-study, that 18th chapter. But it's well worth reading and well worth noting. I had a poem, a long 2-page poem that somebody wrote about this, and I tried to locate it for this session of camp and could not find it. I went to a management institute several years running when I was working at General Conference, Christian Management Association, their annual institute. And one of the guys there read a terrific poem that he'd written about Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, and what good administration really was. And to show you what an excellent administrator I am, I've lost the poem. So, oh well. It'll show up someday when I least expect it, and I'm looking for something else. Yeah, put it with my notes here, yeah. Anyway, for what it's worth. But it is a great story, and you'll learn something from your self-study of the 18th chapter. So which one of the Ross boys does not carry a part of their dad's name, except for the last name Ross, of course? This is ultimate trivia. Okay, we carry a part of our dad, that's for sure. Genetically, that's hard to escape. But Wesley's name, his initials spell war. Wesley Arthur Ross. And Lorne Arthur Ross was the given name for my dad by his adoptive parents. We talked about that Sunday morning. My dad's adoptive parents was Lorne Arthur Ross. So Wesley Arthur Ross, who was born in the hospital in Portsmouth when Dad was pastor in Elliott, Maine, he carries my dad's middle name. Brent, you'd have to know the story Monday morning to know that Brent's first name, which is really James, he was a Southerner before he moved south, because a lot of people in the South go by their middle names. I mean, how many times have I gone to a hospital looking for somebody and I find out they don't have them? I said, well, they got to be here. I know they're here. But they go by their middle name. And so I usually learn that the hard way when I'm looking for them somewhere. But a lot of Southerners, I wouldn't say half, but it seems like half the Southern men that I know go by their middle names. And Brent always has, but his first name is James. And the name on that birth certificate from Lowell, Massachusetts, from 101 years ago next month, is James Morris. Is there a middle name on there, Steve? I can't remember. It's in your custody now. I don't think, but the name is James Morris. So I know that we come from a family of Morrises somewhere. My mom was from the Collins family, and Advent Christians know the Collinses because my Uncle Oral, Mom's younger brother, taught at Berkshire for many years. So Collins, we know our heritage there, and also our DNA enough to know some of our health issues we should be looking for. But whenever they ask about diabetes on those, I always say my maternal grandmother, because Grandma Collins was diabetic. So I know a little bit about my past, but not a whole lot. Anyway, so Brent's first name is the name on my dad's birth certificate, and not many people would know that. But Steve's middle name is Lorne, and he wasn't named after the guy on Bonanza, Lorne Green. He was named after Dad's first name, even though most people called him Larry, but his name was Lorne Ross. So my middle name is Edmund, who was actually there was an Edmund in both families. In my dad's case, it was an Uncle Edmund from his adoptive family. But anyway, but I didn't get any of my dad's names. In fact, I didn't get a lot of his characteristics. Some people say that I look a lot like him, but actually my mom had brown eyes, and I'm the only one of the four boys who has brown eyes. And so I know that's my mom's side of the family. And what I tell people is that's my brothers in earlier years used to tell me brown eyes are because of what you're full of. I don't want to believe that, but it's anyway. But I'm the only one who has them. Anyway, so I didn't inherit any of his names, but there's a family member named Edmund. He had an uncle, Edmund, and Mom had one on her side of the family too. So I guess that's the name that both families liked. So I'm not Edmund Muskie, even though I grew up in Waterville, because his was spelled with a U, E-D-M-U-N-D. Senator Edmund Muskie, who once ran for vice president of the United States. When I was in high school, he was running with Hubert H. Humphrey for the ticket, and by the grace of God, they lost. But that's another story for another time. So anyway, that's the trivia. That's the day. We're up to 11:45, so we need to knock it off. So tomorrow we'll let me tell you what you'll need to, actually, I don't think you can read what we're going to cover tomorrow, but I'll tell you what it involves. The 19th chapter, we're going to start, the first question will involve the first two verses of chapter 19. So 4 or 5 questions will come out of Exodus 19. Then we're going to jump over to Exodus 34 at the end of the book. And then we're going to do the Numbers story of the spies going out, because that's very important. And Moses' leadership there is very important. So we're going to jump over Numbers 11, 12, and 13, that part of the story. That'll be the first session tomorrow. Then in the second session, we're going to look at God's judgment, chapters 13 and 14 of Numbers, and jump back to the last book. This is really, we're going to do kind of a summary thing on Friday. So we're going to jump all the way to Deuteronomy. We quoted the last verse of Deuteronomy 34 already. It's been on every day's outline. But we're going to look at the first few verses of Deuteronomy 34, which is kind of a recap of his life and characteristics. So if you're going to read anything for tomorrow, the 19th chapter would be good, the last chapter of Exodus, and then chapters 11 through 14, probably the spies and God's punishment for their lack of faith with the spies and all that, and how Moses handled all that stuff. And then the first few verses of Deuteronomy 34. And that's about all we can do, because he wrote too many books for us to cover in 1 week. But you're getting an idea. You're hitting some of the highlights and some of the lowlights, and all of them are instructive. So thanks for coming today. Appreciate your being here with us.